Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. You're watching Daily Debrief. I'm Siddhantani, and on the show today, we have the latest from anti-coup demonstrations in Sudan and on the killings of Shireen Abu Aqhleh in Palestine and Jayland Walker in the United States. First up, Sudan's coup leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, announced that the army will withdraw from ongoing political talks, making way for the formation of a civilian transitional government. Before al-Burhan's announcement, hundreds of protesters took the streets for 4 straight days, demanding an end to military rule. It was a deadly week in which the death toll among protesters since the coup on October 25, 2021 went up to 114. A particularly violent crackdown last Thursday during mass rallies killed 9 people and injured over 600, making it the deadliest single day of violence in this period, according to Sudan Doctors Committee, which has been tracking casualties. Large-scale protests continue in Khartoum and other areas despite the general's announcement, which is, of course, being met with its fair share of skepticism. Recent protests have seen crowds burn tires and barricade roads with bricks, while security forces have responded by using lethal ammunition, along with barrages of tear gas and powerful water cannons. Meanwhile, there are reports of continued troop buildup, including both the army as well as rapid security forces, headed by Burhan's second-in-command, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, or Hameti. Prashant, what are the events that could have led to this sort of quite sudden announcement on the part of al-Burhan?
Well, it's not actually very sudden, because we do know that there's been this momentum has been kind of building up. Now, there are 2 aspects. One is, of course, the fact that ever since the coup in October 2021, there has been mass resistance. It has been continuous. It has been relentless. People on the streets, and this is not resistance organized by one political party or something. These are resistance. These are waves of resistance organized by the streets. There's a lot of organized activity taking place at every level across the country, and consistently these organizations, these groups, they are pushed against the military coup of October 2021. So we do know that the coup, the military regime has not really been given a chance to sort of settle down and extend its tentacles, so to speak, which is often what happens when a coup takes place. The initial, couple of months, they really kind of consolidate. Here, the opposite has happened, in the sense that the people have consistently pushed back against the military coup, although even at times when there was no real end in sight. So on the one hand, that has been happening. On the other hand, the international community is increasingly concerned about what has been happening. It has been pushing for its own agenda, so to speak, on this. And that agenda involves the fact that they do not really want the military to entirely leave power. So they would rather have some kind of a compromise between the military and certain sections of the political establishment, which are not too radical. That's a key point, because a lot of the slogans that have come out of the protests in Sudan over the years, starting from 2018, end of 2018, when this huge march took place, starting from that time, many of the slogans, many of the demands have been very radical. And the international community, especially the West, is quite worried about these kind of demands, being actually accepted, considering the strategic importance of Sudan. So they would rather have some kind of a system where the military and the civilians sort of coexist. There is a civilian, veneer, so to speak, and a military control continues to retain a large amount of power. So that is what they have been pushing for. And in keeping both these contexts in mind, it is not really surprising that Burhan has made the offer that he is making. Important to note, of course, that the military will still be in charge until a new government is formed. After that, they'll sort of reorganize and create a structure which will be in charge of the military. Again, it will have much more control than just over the military. The military also controls a lot of the economic levers of Sudan. So nothing of that really is going to change. So what Burhan's announcement seems to be is more of a tactical move to ensure that things do not get too out of hand. And we know that last week's repression, which killed this number of people, was an especially unprecedented one, because so many deaths taking place, hundreds of people injured, which is only likely to inflame the protests further, which is only likely to make people more angry. So keeping all this in mind, it is likely that there is already a timetable, and maybe the events of the past week may also have accelerated a bit, but this is in some senses very much sticking to the plan, so that there is an orderly retreat, so to speak, where the elite sections can preserve their interest, where the Western powers, for instance, get to also continue to have a stake in Sudan, and nothing too radical, nothing too disturbing comes to the picture. So that's where we are at. That's why this offer is coming right now.
So, like you pointed out, I mean, the economic situation in Sudan is also not getting any better, and much of that also in the control of the military. In the context of all of that, how are political groups, civilian political groups, receiving this announcement and looking at the way forward?
So broadly, I mean, if you take some of the major political groups, you have the the forces of Omar al-Bashir, so associated with Omar al-Bashir, the former dictator who was overthrown. They're very close to the military. There is the Forces for Freedom and Change, the FFC, which consists of a series of centrist political parties which have been sort of negotiating with the media, with the military continuously. And then there is a far more radical sections, the Sudanese Communist Party, the trade unions, the neighborhood resistance committees, etc. Now, the expectation of the international community has largely been that the forces for freedom of change, which are more of the centrist sections, will align, work out some kind of arrangement with the military. However, the FFC has, in this case, refused Burhan's offer. They have also accurately pointed out that this is just kind of concealing what's really going to happen. That the military will still have a huge amount of power. So that, in some senses, is probably a bit of a blow to the plan of the Western forces and the military. Now it's an open question as to whether the FFC is saying this for rhetorical purposes now and it will go back on its word. There have been such instances in the past, because even earlier the compromises between the military and the civilian sections were struck by this FFC, and the left at that point had condemned those compromises. So that's a very important aspect, whether this will really kind of, FFC will stick to its stand. And if it does, what happens is only the forces largely associated with Omar al-Bashir, the discredited dictator, they will be left to form, an alliance with the military, in which case they might form the government or something, which is really not likely to solve anything at all. And the unfortunate situation for the FFC also is that even its machinations have been kind of condemned and exposed by the sentiment on the streets. So there is very little patience even with them, as far as so even they don't have too much room to maneuver. And while if they compromise with the military, it might please the international sections. It is not likely to please their own population, which will continue these protests. So that's how the broad responses have been. It remains to be seen, how serious the military is. Does it take more steps? Does it, stop any of these repressive activities? There's no real sign of that.
Right.
And it's really a question of the balance of forces right now between these various sections. Will the FFC realize the sentiment on the street and take a stand and say that we will not cooperate whatever happens until the military completely withdraws, which has really been the demand on the streets, that there should be no military involvement in the government at all. And the next step is the economy and all that. So that's really, Sudan is at a bit of a cusp right now. It's been building since October 2021. People were not sure when this moment would be reached. So I think 2 or 3 key questions. One is, how serious is Burhan and his associates about actually sort of withdrawing from power, or is it just a feint? How serious are the centrist political parties about sticking to their principles, or the current principles, and how strong will be the resistance movement on the streets? I think these 3 questions are vital in the coming weeks.
All right. Stick around, Prashant, for the next story as well. We're talking about the latest in investigations around the death of veteran journalist Shireen Abu Aqhleh. Forensic scientists from the United States have said gunfire from Israeli security forces positions is likely responsible for the death of the journalist. But in a statement on Monday, Ned Price of the US State Department also seemed to conclude that the shooting was not intentional. Prashant is here to help us understand these probes, who's conducting them, and how the US State Department can read the intentions of soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces. Prashant, what led to this US conclusion, and how does it sort of compare with other investigations?
Right. So, I mean, this is all based on forensics around a bullet. Now, that story itself is controversial because the bullet was handed over by the Palestinian Authority to the US for the US to do a probe. And then it was turned around and Israel said they would do the probe in the presence of US officials. So it's quite absurd because, I mean, on the one hand, the US is saying that, okay, we are not able to establish the origin of the bullet, as in, who supplied it, etc.
Right.
Secondly, they say it's likely it could have been from the Israeli side, but they're pretty sure it's not a deliberate attempt. Now, this really goes against the grain of what a lot of other probes have conducted. Now, we must remember that after Shireen Abu Aqleh was murdered brutally, the first response by Israel was that the Palestinians killed her.
Yeah.
Right. And then it took human rights organizations like B'Tselem, other groups, Palestinian groups, of course, all of whom pointed out that it made no sense. Then there were investigations which showed that it made no sense for the Palestinians. And it didn't work out logically. Yeah. Right. So even Palestinians accidentally could not have killed her. Now, ever since the Israeli angle is being investigated, the UN, for instance, the UN Human Rights Body, for instance, released a report which took a much more stronger stance. And, there were indications that this could have been, there was a good chance that this was actually deliberated and intentional killing, in the sense that you have snipers. These are basically snipers, right? Yeah. And these are people, highly trained military officials. These are not some random people with a gun. And with the kind of bullet that was used, it is very unlikely that this was just random firing that was happening, which was the conclusion that many groups had reached. And Israel consistently has, of course, denied all these claims. And what the US report has done, which is what many activists have pointed out, Shireen Abu Aqhleh's family has pointed out, is that it pretty much whitewashes Israel, gives, makes it look like at worst it was an unfortunate accident. Right. Whereas all reports from the ground indicate exactly the opposite. The fact that these people were clearly wearing press vests,
jackets, yeah.
the fact that they had been moving away, and the fact that they were hit shows that this is unlikely
Anything
to have
but
been just a
accidental.
random accident. And there's also long, this is a long trajectory or long trend of journalists being targeted by Israeli forces, despite the fact that they have been wearing press vests. So this is nothing new. The same thing happened during the Great March of Return protests in Gaza as well. Many other instances, all of them have been well chronicled. So keeping all this in mind, the US, the US statement at this point seems just more of a way to sort of try to reduce the controversy by splitting hairs and then making all of this making out to seem that this was, which again is often, even when Israeli forces are in the dock, the attempt is always to say, oh, this is an accident, this was a one-off thing, rather than the fact that this is actually a structured, consistent attempt to target Palestinians, which is what has been happening all this while in the occupied territories. So that's really how we need to, and this has been rightly condemned by Shireen Abu Aqleh's family, by Palestinian solidarity activists, by the Palestinian Authority for that matter. So keeping all this in mind, a very backward step as far as investigations and justice for Shireen are concerned.
Right. And is there a broader political context as well in which these investigations are taking place?
Right. It's a good thing you asked, because we have Joe Biden going to visit the region in a few days. I think probably next week or something, Biden is in the region. He's going to meet, he's of course going to Israel, he's going to meet with the Palestinian Authority. And I think the US statement also needs to be seen in the context of this visit, something to keep both sides happy, so to speak.
Right.
But the fact here really is that the Palestinian Authority even if the Palestinian Authority can somehow be mollified by some kind of, say, offers or these things or whatever, the spirit on the streets is very much different from that. And from the videos, from the testimonies, everyone is very clear about the fact that this was an Israeli attack on a journalist. So however the US tries to spin this to sort of lay the ground for Biden's visit, nothing is really going to change as far as public perception goes, as far as the truth goes for that matter, and as far as international condemnation goes. So this is probably, so for all you know, the US calculation is more in terms of how, what it wants to negotiate with Israel in the coming weeks. Israel has a new prime minister, of course. There's political chaos, as has been the case for years in Israel. So this is also probably laying the ground for Biden's own attempts at negotiation in the region, because he's going to definitely, there are multiple things that are going on. There is Israel, there is the US-Iran nuclear deal negotiations. Israel has huge objections to that. The kind of relationships between Israel and the US, are the other US allies in the region. So he's going to play a balancing game to ensure that the US dominance in the region remains, paramount. And they would definitely like to sort of, for this not to be an issue. So this is probably a very cynical play as far as that is concerned. And as usual, as we know, the United States never addressing the fact that all these atrocities are happening. A lot of these atrocities are happening with weapons and aid supplied by the United States. It's the amount of military aid it gives to Israel is quite incalculable, actually. So all this being there, there's no, the US is no neutral arbiter. It has no real, it can't stand and be an umpire and say that we'll give a fair judgment, when the fact is it is explicitly complicit in the murder and the human rights violations, in the atrocities that are taking place in Palestine.
All right. Thanks very much, Prashant. And finally, the US city of Akron, Ohio has declared a state of emergency and imposed an overnight curfew downtown after hundreds of protesters marched through the streets to denounce the police killing of a black man, 25-year-old Jayland Walker, who allegedly fled from a traffic stop for an unspecified violation. The mayor of the city has blamed escalation of peaceful protests into what he called significant property damage for the decision to impose a 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew in the city. The fourth and largest protest took place on Sunday, hours after body camera footage of Walker's killing was released, showing police firing up to as many as 90 rounds as they pursued Walker on foot after a brief car chase. The NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has called it murder point blank and added that this doesn't happen to white people in America. For more on the story, I spoke earlier to Natalia Marquez of People's Dispatch.
Natalia, good to have you back on Daily Debrief. You've been following
events as they unfolded after the shooting of Jayland Walker. Could you first please give us a situation update as to what's going on the ground?
Yeah, so there have been protests last week, all weekend, and protests yesterday. People have been on the streets demanding accountability for police. The mayor of Akron, and as a response to the protests, has declared a curfew from 9 p.m. Monday to 6 a.m. from Monday to Tuesday. There has been tear gas has been deployed against protesters by police. 50 people have been arrested for these protests. So there already has been some repression against the protests last night and over the weekend.
And what is sort of the history of this region when it comes to sort of police violence, police brutality? And what are protesters who are out on the streets, on the ground, what are they demanding?
Yeah, so, they're demanding right now that the city fire and prosecute the officers responsible. So Jayland Walker was shot 60 times by police officers. It was, Jayland Walker is one person, and there were 8 officers who shot at him. He was a Black man, and 7 of those 8 officers were white. So protesters are pointing out the systemic racism inherent in the police force in Akron. Those officers are now on paid administrative leave, so no consequences thus far. Protesters are saying that they should be prosecuted for murder because they did kill someone, and that they also be fired. And since Jayland Walker was killed during a traffic stop for committing some sort of alleged traffic violation, which shouldn't carry the death penalty, even though it did for him, protesters are demanding an end to armed traffic enforcement and an end to the protocol of police chases. So police chased Jayland Walker in their vehicle, and this can be highly dangerous, not just for the people involved, but also for bystanders who can be hit. Just these very broad, sweeping demands of the police system right now.
Right. So how are you how are you looking at events proceeding in the next few days from now? As because we've seen the response from the police department, and it's been largely to sort of say that this is in the process of either defending themselves or potential threat and all of those things. The usual sort of terminology that we get to hear when these kind of shootings happen, these killings happen. So how do you see things going forward?
Well, I hope that there is some, true accountability. These police officers are still on paid leave, there's no accountability there. The body cam footage just came out. It was just released. Police still claim that Jayland Walker shot at them while they were chasing him in their vehicle. The police body cam footage does not make this clear. So they still have very little to no proof of this claim. The city keeps repeating that they're doing an investigation. They're not throwing out any accusations yet of the people responsible, but the people of Akron and the United States, they've seen this body cam footage. The police claims are inconclusive. What it does show is Jayland Walker being fired at, 60 times. Jayland Walker was, fired at 60 times. Then on the ground, he was handcuffed after he was already dead. So this is, a really brutal killing. I think people will continue to be on the streets. I think, there's a possibility of even more police repression of those protests, but I hope not. People are on the ground, and I think that, people's demands are more likely to be heard the more that they're on the ground protesting. So I hope to see more of that.
All right. Thanks very much for that update, Natalia. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief from Natalia, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team. Thanks very much for watching. You can get more details on these stories and the rest of the work we do from our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And also give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll, of course, be back again tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.